Hello, 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 everyone. Can you all hear me all right? All the way in the back? All good? Before we start, I want to ask you 3 short questions just to kind of get going. First of all, what kind of cheese do you use to catch a bear? Camembert. What's doormat in Spanish? Matador. And if you're American in the living room, what are you in the bathroom? European. Now that I've set your expectations on a good level, hello, welcome to my talk. I'm Hugo, come from the Lund office, live in Malmö, joined in June. And I'm here today to talk to you about the subjective side of performance, web performance, and the psychology of waiting. Now, before we dive too much into that, who am I? What am I doing here? I'm a dad and developer by day. By night, I'm a elite hacker gamer kid. Super cool. If I had to describe myself in one sentence, it would be a pseudo-engineer that is forever plagued by the big picture in every feature I develop. I'm a bit of a strange one. I studied a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master of Industrial Economics. So I started out with HR, marketing, organizational psychology, focused on innovation, the psychology of innovation, entrepreneurship. Realized that none of that was interesting. Well, actually, the financial crisis decided that none of that was interesting. So picked up a vocational degree in programming, started teaching, and today I'm a jack of most trades and master of few. I've worked with enterprise development, I've worked with product development, on-premise, cloud, software as a service, DB as a service, various apps, and software distribution for roughly 7 years now. Why this topic? Why did I choose this topic? Well, I burned for the round trip when I came in here and kind of started looking at what is interesting to me as a developer. My passion is the user wanting something, sending that to a server, the logic that processes and finds that for them, and sending that back and showing it to them. That whole circle is super interesting to me. And I want something fast and responsive that shows me the data I want fast. So that whole thing never really ceases to intrigue me and amaze me because every user is different and every use case is different. Consumer behavior is really, really weird. And to illustrate my point, you are looking at a $400 toaster. What? I don't even know. But it sells, right? So somehow it works. I'm an avid people watcher. I worked in service and sales before this for almost 10 years. So I'm kind of used to finding the most nonsensical solutions to people's problems. I've had so many situations where doing the right thing was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And finding these out-of-the-box answers is something that is kind of like one of my favorite pastimes. Every time somebody asks me a question, I want to find the strange answer to it. Today, we have a pretty simple agenda. I want to talk a little bit about performance. Then I want to talk a little bit about psychology. Then talk about waiting, which is kind of the main body. And try and tie all of this fluffy stuff together into some examples that I've encountered during my professional experience, career, what do you want to call it, time. Just to be clear, there won't be any code. This is not a code-based presentation. There will be a lot of technical stuff in between, but my point here is I want to try and instill a new thought in you. All of this started when I was reading an article, kind of following up on 2021, what's happening in performance, and somebody referencing a very old psychological article that I knew, and that kind of got me thinking about this. So the talk is more about sharing that inspiration with you and hopefully making you think differently about something you already do today. Cool. Performance. What's performance? Off the top of your head, just scream something out. What does it mean, performance, web performance? What do we mean? Fast? Optimized? We typically talk about 6 different things. We talk about measurements, objective, quantifiable metrics that are common in most applications. We talk about load, so how well we perform. Response times are affected by different levels of load. We talk about stress, what happens when we put a lot of stress on a system. Talk about spike, what happens when we get a sudden dramatic increase. Endurance, how do we perform over time? If we have a high load over a long period of time, how does that affect us? We talk about volume, so when we all of a sudden see large amounts of data, what happens then? And of course, scalability, how do we scale? We've built something, it's performant, but when we scale it times 3, what happens? Do we see a linear increase? What kind of factor do we get out of our scaling? And this is all, when you look at this, kind of under what you just mentioned, the scope of fast response times. That's kind of how we picture and think about performance, right? It comes down to, from that a request comes in until it goes out, or preferably all the way to the client, how much time did that take? That's what we think about. We measure this for several different reasons. We want to understand how fast our application is, when it's not, and how it performed over time. Reason being, first of all, health. It gives us a great insight into the health of our application, how things are going. If we add something new to it, what is the impact on the application? And any early warning of anything that's coming up, right? Are we exceeding a capacity of something? Are we starting to see spikes occurring? It gives us the ability to verify our results by kind of following these objective, quantifiable metrics. We can go to our industry fellows and access their deep knowledge and compare our results easily. I can go to a colleague who doesn't know my project and tell them about the specific response time under load, for example, and they might still be able to help me or at least understand the problem I'm facing. Finally, it builds accountability. It sets up historical data, which allows us to look at trends and allows us to also compare things that are happening now against December of this year, Black Friday, or is that November maybe, compared to last year. And all of a sudden go, okay, this is actually normal. What we often miss is perceived performance. Perceived performance is how fast an application feels. And that's a lot harder to measure. We miss this for the simple reason that, or for several reasons, but one of the simplest ones is bias, right? We're only as good as our measurements. And as any good engineer, we typically tend to fix the things we measure. So over time, we typically see better and better metrics, but we might have forgotten a certain area or a certain condition that users experience daily. We don't get any insight into satisfaction. How good it felt is not a quantifiable thing. That's something that users report. And finally, also, we can't really account for personality because every single audience is unique. Within any given application, you typically have several different audiences interacting. You have the users, you might have the moderators and the administrators, and all of them will have different expectations on the application and also different behavior in the application. So to start kind of looking at this, Google in 2019 introduced what's called Web Vitals, which is a more detailed approach of looking at the web page itself, where they measure the start time. So from that you hit enter until anything at all comes back, how long does that take? From that something came back until we see something, the first contentful paint, FCP, how long does that take? How long does it take for the largest amount of stuff to show, the largest contentful paint? During all of this, how much did the layout kind of move around, something we all kind of know with cumulative layout shift, CLS? And finally, the first input delay, which is from that, they started downloading until the user could start using the website. This is Google specific. They're measured on Chrome-based browsers. So yes, we don't capture all of it, but I think we still capture a pretty large amount of users. And it does provide some emotive metric, I'd like to say, especially the layout shift is something that is very connected to emotion, at least for me. So it's a great first step, but we're still not really capturing everything. And I think also we're starting to get to a point of diminishing returns where performance metrics are pretty damn good, and we're probably not going to be able to measure much more, like different metrics. I think we're actually at already a pretty good place. Why do we measure all of these things? Well, because it's expensive to be slow. It's really expensive to be slow. You lose trust. 75% of users that experience poorly performing websites will not buy from it. Just straight up won't. It costs money. Google saw a 20% decrease in ad revenue with a 2-second increase in load time. That's Google. It costs a lot of money. Amazon saw 1% of sales lost for every 100 milliseconds added. That's a lot of money. It causes stress. Poor performance means users have to concentrate more using your app or using your website. And finally, it caused satisfaction. Bing saw that a 2-second delay in page load times led to a 4% loss in user satisfaction. So it's an important thing to look at, and it is an important thing to measure. Now, some of these are response time based, right? Or actually all of them, but in here is also, having to concentrate more, losing satisfaction, losing trust. And those are not quantifiable things, but they're very real, and they have a direct impact on our bottom line. And that's because of psychology. So psychology is one of my favorite subjects ever since high school. I've been interested in psychology. I actually wanted to go into academia until I realized how much work it is to write a psychology essay. So I went into marketing. But it's super interesting, right? Behavior is wonderfully weird, and you can never know all of it. So perhaps the biggest takeaway from psychology that I can give you is it's counterintuitive. So one of my favorite examples regarding waiting is Houston Airport. They received a lot of complaints that it took too long to get luggage. Instead of even trying to speed up the time it takes to get luggage, they just increased the distance you had to walk by 6. Complaints dropped drastically. And now we're starting to get into what I would like to convey to you today. It's sometimes you need to do a counterintuitive solution to your problem. Users want flow. They want to have, I think we all know the state of flow. We're talking to a bunch of developers. Users experience uninterrupted flow within 1 to 2 second response time. So within 1 to 2 seconds, the flow will simply continue, and they won't even really register the load. They want to be productive. We want them to be productive. To maintain concentration and productivity, a response in under 3 seconds is necessary. So past that point, we're starting to affect concentration. And if we get all the way up to 10 seconds or more, a thought process breaks down. You lose track of your thoughts. You get distracted. And you get frustrated. These are all still related to quantifiable metrics of response times. And these are all very valid facts that I would like to just point out, because yes, we do still need to do the quantifiable measurements. We do still need to perform. Absolutely, that's not what I'm trying to say. But there is a very interesting thing about users. One of the things that caught me first was sometimes the pages my users had problems with were not the slow ones. And one way to summarize that is users won't wait 6 seconds for a clickbait story, but will wait 10 seconds or more for Gmail to start. And the first time I saw this, I kind of sat back and I went like, yeah, do I think Gmail is slow? Sure, but I never really thought about it. And that's because the way Gmail is designed, the way Gmail makes me use it, makes me go around the slow parts. So I never really end up in a place where the slowness affects me. You end up kind of leaving it open, and then things trickle in as they come. If you sit and refresh it all the time, yeah, that's slow. So that really got me thinking about, okay, why don't I register that at all? Because Google I have pretty high expectations on. But in other cases, such as the clickbait news articles, I get angry within 2 seconds. And well, that's because of the psychology behind the behavior of waiting. Hi. Okay. Now we get into the really interesting part. So anxious waiting. So when we are in a state of anxiousness, time takes longer. For example, the last 5 minutes leading up to this presentation took about as much time as the 40 minutes before it. Uncertain weights, which is something that a lot of web users, I think, are familiar with. Uncertain weights are longer than known finite weights. When I don't know how long something is going to take, it just feels longer right away. Unexplained weights, when all of a sudden, for no reason, something takes longer than everything else, I will pay extra attention to that, and that time span will get magnified. Boring. Unfair, which is super subjective, weights feel way longer than equitable weights. So if I, for some reason, feel like I like get bored for no reason or because of a bad app, that's the nice way of calling it, I've had it called other things, that will get magnified. And then finally, value. The more value of the service that we're requesting or the page we're going to, the longer we will wait happily. And Gmail is a great example of that. Gmail is very valuable, and therefore we don't even really think about the waits. We're already at the end destination. Impatience, just to kind of go into it in a bit more detail. What is it about? It's about I want to know that things are working so that I can mentally commit to it. It means to render something, navigation, something personal, as soon as possible to let the user know that, okay, you have gotten started. And one guide star that I use a lot is most views and requests by a user are just intermediary. Don't try to predict where the user is going to go. Provide them with the option as quickly as possible to continue navigating. Because the user will find their own way to the value if you just give them the option. Boring. I think we all know this one on the right. The feeling of boredom is not having a subject to control. That's my personal opinion. Just showing something while data is loading lets users get started. It could be static, but providing them with something to do removes the effect of boredom and lowers the perceived waiting time and increases perceived performance. So ask yourself always, what else can you show? Is it a quote of the day? Is it some aggregate data? What do you have that you can show while something is taking a long time to load? And I will come back to that in my example later. When an action has an effect, I want to know that it went okay. This is not telling me that it went okay, especially not when it's Windows 11. If there's an extended wait for a result, I want to be continuously reassured that things went okay. I want to get a continuous feedback like, yes, this is taking a long time, but everything is still all right. And if I do get a bad result, I want it to be presented in a friendly way where I can clearly tell what happened so that the next time I have to do the same thing again, I don't feel as anxious. It's a continuous thing. So there's the how can I put it, the preemptive part, but then there's also the following up and putting users in a better state for next time, building trust. Unexplained. Why did this page take 5 times longer to load? Why is saving taking forever? Why don't submitted jobs appear right away? Why are my changes not reflected immediately? These are questions I have gotten in almost every single project I've ever been in. They happen all the time. And what is it really telling me? It's telling me that I'm not empowering and informing my users ahead of time. I know when I built the thing that it would take a long time. But for some reason, it just never made it out to the front end, to the user, where they click something, and I just tell them in advance, hey, this is going to take a while, but it's fine. And then we get all kinds of questions. This is one of the simplest ways that you can look over your existing architecture and increase perceived performance, is just finding the tickets you have already gotten with these questions and asking yourself, how can I empower and inform my users to make better decisions by communicating the expense of the query ahead of time? Wouldn't help you in the case on the left, though. Not sure what happened there. Uncertain. Modern systems are heavily interconnected and need time to reconcile before yielding a final result. That's just how it's starting to become, whether it's due to the architecture you chose or you're using various different sources. Things take longer now on the backends than they did before because we're querying more things. So I posit to you that it's better for something to be immediately okay and then fail. Don't bother figuring out if it will work or not. I would even go as far as saying asynchronous actions should have a synchronous result. And one of my favorite examples of this, one of my all-stars when it comes to the waiting game, and I'll get back to that in a second, are food orders. You place an order, you pay the money, and you immediately get a result. You get thank you for your order. On the back end, nothing has happened. The restaurant hasn't gotten your order, nobody has confirmed it, nothing, but you immediately feel good and comfortable because you have gotten your receipt, or what do you want to call it, saying thank you. Meanwhile, there's things happening. And that's a super important thing psychologically. Value. That last wait was 30 seconds with a WSOD, white screen of death. A lot of your users are seeing those every day. So think about that. Make sure that the user knows what they are waiting for and why. Preview the result, build anticipation, and make sure that it won't disappoint. And my favorite example of this is Steam. I can press the play button before I've even downloaded the game. It just gives me another waiting window, so I now have two, but somehow I've already touched it, and they've done nothing. That's because value is perceived, not predetermined. Now, I can't offer you concrete tips in your specific case with your specific users, but I'm sure your users could. So find ways to figure out what is valuable to them, what are the things in your system that they use and want to get, and try to make sure that they know when it's coming. No more waiting. We're done with the waiting. What's a good wait? Well, back to food orders. Remove the need to wait on a page. Allow them to come back and check on progress. So that's exactly what food orders do. You just refresh that page later and your order is confirmed, and that's fine. Usually, like I was thinking about it, I pay, what could it be, 30 euros to Foodora, and then I just close my phone and I'll wait an hour for food to show up, but I won't even think about it. I might open it once or twice, but the waiting as such, the 1 hour wait, is non-existent in my mind. That's because I don't have to, I'm not stuck in here. It can fail, it can get canceled, but it shouldn't break. It's fine for something to come back later and say, sorry, your order was declined, blah, blah, blah. At least then it didn't just catastrophically disappear or something and I'm left with uncertainty. And accountability, so exposing the underlying process, telling me how far along I am in a more concrete way than a generic progress bar, that builds trust. Because it gives me the feeling that I'm in control of this process. Being exposed to these 4 steps makes me feel like I have something to say about it, even though I still don't. And this is probably not what's happening either. Developer performance counts too. Responsiveness builds trust, and trust gives patience. So keep it simple. Build things that are easy to understand, maintain, and extend, even if it's uglier. Attentiveness. Users accept things missing or being broken as long as you can quickly react to their requests. So if you launch with what you think is an important feature missing, and then a user asks for it, and you can deliver it to them in a reasonable amount of time, depending on where you are, that's still fine. That actually builds trust, because the user feels recognized. And that time is also part of perceived performance. I don't know how many times I've heard, oh, they're just going to be super slow about it. They never respond to my tickets, et cetera, et cetera. And then you build frustration, and then that spills out over everything else you offer. And finally, with patience, you get a willingness of oversight. You get forgiveness. So when we do break something, or when something does take long, if you've managed to build that trust capital, that psychological trust with your user, they'll still kind of feel that it's fine. So taking all of this and looking at it in the real world, basically what I want to do is give you 3 simple examples from my professional career, my life, what I've encountered, what the problem was or what the use case was, what the front end did and what the back end did. That's it, just 3 examples. First of all, anxiety. Such a horrible word. Long-running jobs. I work with a lot of big data, and it has to be crunched from one object to another over and over, and that takes time. So basically, the user wants to trigger a long-running process on the backend. The creation itself takes a really long time because we have to bootstrap a bunch of things. And even after that, there's no kind of immediate result. You just kind of get a yes, we got it, and then nothing happens for a couple of minutes before it starts showing up in UIs. So on the front end, we have had tactics for handling this for a while. We use skeleton UIs to handle extended waiting, where we kind of populate it with nothing. We split the view into multiple components. We can populate them individually. And this kind of gives the user comfort by showing them a familiar layout and making a long wait feel shorter due to tangible and concrete progress. What you can do on the back end is just not validate your data, basically. Don't wait for a full bootstrap and queuing to occur before committing. Just commit something. Create a skeleton job. Give it a stable ID and shove that in there. Send it back right away and offer a separate endpoint for fetching updates or your regular endpoints. But all of a sudden, you've unblocked a massive thing on the front end, which is taking the user not just to an thank you so much for submitting, but to the actual page. And that gives me the feeling that, okay, this worked. Now I'm on the order received step of the order. It's still not confirmed, but it gives me that extra thing. It's a super small change that I don't think I've ever come across a backend that did that immediately, actually. It was something we always kind of had to add. We didn't really change anything else in the performance. Inexplicable waiting times. Mining complex data. Basically, the user wants to search a complex data set consisting of many different entities, things coming from everywhere. And what happens when they want to do that, you just kind of type into your regular search, you have a little input box and you have a couple of drop-downs, and you think that, you know, it shouldn't be too hard, except for that drop-down number 3 increases the search time by 5 for some reason. What's even more interesting is that what users will then typically do with, at least the searches I've worked with, is they will inspect a couple of data points in the result set. They usually get a couple of thousand results or whatever, and then export it anyway for further analysis in Excel or something. So on the front end, we know not to overload users. We tend to be strongly opinionated, where we limit search options, columns, and even results displayed. Didn't find what you're looking for, learn to search better then. Quite frankly. It's very common, for example, to just not offer pagination or only offer pagination of the first 5. And if you're past that, I would say past 2, search again. On the back end, you could denormalize your data into search and full entities. So you have your regular big old data set where everything is stored, and then you just create a second table or whatever it is where you just put just the search stuff. If you're working with truly big data, you don't need to be up to date. Users are more than happy to have several hours old data if it's easy to mine and export. So don't even try to be up to date. Finally, run periodic aggregation, where you take all that complex data and mash it down into something flat and searchable. And if you do that right, that's also already your export. Again, a small step you can do on your backend that does not really require you to tackle anything of your bottlenecks, but still gives users a much better experience. Finally, boredom. Sequential application states. This is very common in front-ends nowadays, that I've seen at least. You have a large front-end application that is communicating with multiple services. Usually there's like, 30 of them for some reason. Fetching requires many different resources before being bootstrapped, and we kind of need to fetch from one place first to be able to get some stuff I need for the next set, so we get this kind of waterfall effect across services. If you have a complex boot sequence in the front end, show it. Communicate to the user what is happening and allow each step to have an impact on the user interface. Literally tell them, now I'm fetching this, now I'm fetching that, and try to get something out in between every step. Users will often close or cancel as soon as they can, so make sure it's easy for a user to see if they're in the right place or not. Right? If you're trying to show the detail page of a large job, and for some reason it's going to take a really long time to load, can you offer maybe a summary endpoint so I can fetch just the ID and the title, and at least show that first, and then the user goes, oh wait, this is the wrong one, and they can close it. Split out and prioritize requests that contain high-level location-specific information. So that's kind of, again, what I was saying with some kind of summary endpoint, but also about me as a person. Because it's one thing to see a generic navigation bar, it's a completely different thing to see my name there. Because then I know, okay, you're talking to me. On the back end, offer user-specific data on a fast and inexpensive endpoint. Let it be old, but offer it. Usually not very popular, but do it anyway. It allows me to show the user that it's working, and that allows me to comfort the user. Use the index.html file to cram in as much data as you can. Front-end state is localized into the machine, into the browser. Yours is not. So what can you store, at least ephemerally, for your user? Just offer something. And finally, federate and cache important third-party data sources. This is something that's usually hugely unpopular, but really, really helps on the front end. If your UI that is still, it's usually part of the same team, right? Front and back end, usually a part of some kind of bigger team together, and they are querying this other place all the time. Route it through your service, cache it at least somehow, make it faster for them. It's usually the same query anyway. Okay, so here's my padding section, because I thought I'd be over time. But it looks like we do have time, so that's nice. To kind of summarize it all up, think laterally. Don't get stuck into your verticals. Measure both lab and field, absolutely, always measure. That's kind of what keeps us sane and what keeps us on track. Slow down. Faster is not always the answer. And what I'm trying to say here is, I don't know how many, I've had surprisingly high-level meetings about the response time of specific pages. Surprisingly big bosses have sat with me and discussed the loading page of a certain view, and that's really weird. Because really the conversation we should have been having is, why are we trying to show all of this stuff on the same page? Shouldn't we talk about that first? And that does come down to you as a consultant, and maybe even ahead of time, like in the discussion with the client, trying to get them to understand we can make it faster or we can make it better, or both. But slow down, take a second to think. There is no end. The back-end, front-end separation, those days are over. We are in a situation, unfortunately, where we do have a lot of front-end developers who are very unfamiliar and kind of intimidated by the back-end world. And we have a lot of back-end developers who probably feel the same about the front-end world. And they are two very different mind spaces. You do need to think differently. They are very different, but they're also very common, and we can learn from each other. So if you are a back-ender, pick up a hobby project on the side where you do sit with that horrible JavaScript language and learn a little bit about what we have to do when we're fetching from multiple places with only 6 concurrent requests. And front end, sit down and try to, review a Scala pull request. At least keep track of what the other person needs and is able to do, and communicate around allowing user behavior to bleed through into your implementation, as opposed to your implementation bleeding through into user behavior. Decompose. So I read this awesome article a while ago, or a long time ago now, because I'm old now, that was basically called "The Application is Dead, Long Live the App." It was apps had been around for a while, but the article's point was basically those giant kind of suites of products you would get. Like you would get Office with Word and everything. Those days are over, and now users kind of pick and choose from different apps and compose their own workflows. And I think that's a pattern that we can pretty easily support in our APIs and in our apps as well. Instead of trying to offer kind of like this one massive endpoint that solves all the problems in the world, underneath, there's probably 5 services you're calling. Expose them as well, and make it easy to kind of chain them together myself as a front-end consumer. Allow users to dictate their own workflow. Simplicity. Sacrifice functionality that creates bottlenecks or unreliable. Dare to say no. Because yes, it is not fun to have somebody mad with you because you're not going to give them what you want. But sometimes it's better to just say, no, we won't be able to do that, and not have to deal with the 6 months to a year's firefighting and maintenance on the back of it, because it just never really worked, right? That takes away from your responsiveness in other areas. That makes you less able to cater to other requests from users. That makes them frustrated with you, and you kind of get back into a loop. Finally, try to keep things consistent. So focus on offering reliable features, even if they're suboptimal. Try to have that as a mantra. Will this thing be reliably slow? Because at least then that kind of makes sense, and we can communicate around it using another tactic. But if it's all over the place, if it's inconsistent, that's a bit of a problem. And I guess to wrap it all up, the user's transaction may be efficient, but the bitter taste of how long it took pollutes the overall quality of the service. I guess that would be my message to you. Thanks. Five minutes early. Yeah.
Do you think that by introducing this optimistic update, so you let the user know that something happened, but then you also communicate that the wait will last a long time? Do you think that you are raising the expectations of the bar? Because by the time that it can wait half an hour in the future, the user already lost half an hour. So you need to make it up for them. Maybe in the case of offering the food delivery, you offer a coupon or something, because the user waited so half an hour and they're hungry. Now they need to start from the beginning again.
So yes, if that was common. But I would hope that I could have a system where that was uncommon and would work towards that.
Does it sometimes make sense to make the wait longer, just in the terms of trust?
So kind of following up on that example, if we added a retry, like let's say it's not a food order, it's generating a big export for you. And the first time it failed. But instead of telling the user that right away, we retry it because we know it's flaky. And the second time it works, I would argue a longer wait is better.
First things, both excellent talk and delivery. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
To add up on Clavin's question, remember implementing payment workflow a couple of years ago. And the issue with it was the fact that it was super fast. So essentially the payment was processed as soon as you clicked on it. It didn't really feel right because we were used to, working with big, clunky, older banking apps where you don't really see that sort of thing.
Yep.
So for a payment to be processed almost instantaneously. That just doesn't sit right with the users.
Yep.
So what I did back then is essentially implemented a couple of timeouts and loaders on the front end. Just irrelevant messages.
Yep.
Didn't really, did anything. Things like establishing a security connection with the server.
Yeah.
We didn't get any more negative feedback.
Yep.
Because it worked as the users expected it to. So in a way, in that way, the longer waiting time actually.
100%. Sorry, just to go back, I realized I forgot to repeat the questions. The first question I got was essentially, if I do give an optimistic update, if I do give an ID right away and it fails, could that be seen as bad? The answer would be yes, but only if it's common. The second question was, is there any point in time where a longer wait is good? And the answer there was, if a retry fixes the issue, maybe it is worth waiting. And then just after that, we followed up with, sometimes things are too fast. Your example was surrounding payments. I had a client, so it's just a private friend of mine. They run a WordPress site, and the first thing I did was rip out WordPress, and it loads in 0.3 seconds, and I was super happy. We have the meeting where I'm going to hand over the website, and they're like, yeah, sure, but it's too fast. I was like, what do you mean? No, it's too fast between page changes. It feels rude. She's a artist. She's a great person. But I was like, I almost got angry, and then I thought about it. I was like, that actually makes it. Yeah, it does feel rude. It's too fast. So I also added a timeout. I just added. It takes 2 seconds to change page. It doesn't, but it does. And she's super happy, and everyone's super happy. So there's absolutely cases where waiting longer is a good thing. I don't know why WordPress is found. Well, yeah.
Is there any way to measure perceived performance, like any tools or anything that you can use to sort of estimate how, on a scale, the perceived performance of something?
The question is there any way to measure perceived performance? Field-based, so essentially sitting with the users. It's one of those, it's not quantifiable and it shouldn't be either. So unfortunately not. However, the good thing about quantifiable research is it doesn't need to be statistically valid, so you don't need many users. But yeah, it's kind of an ongoing thing.
We have a virtual question.
Sure.
It's how do you add brand loyalty to the psychology of waiting? Can we measure that? Brand loyalty.
How do we add brand loyalty to the psychology of waiting, and can we measure it? I have to remember things from my bachelor now. Well, brand loyalty is one of the important things of brand loyalty is trust, and maintaining that trust, because trust takes a long time to build, but needs to be continuously maintained because it can be easily lost. So yes, in a way, improving, like in keeping your users informed about what they're waiting for. So if you have an app that just takes a long time, and my point here is don't try to make it load faster, tell the user why. Or tell them doing this will take a long time, but it's okay. That builds trust with them. Also, making sure that when things go wrong, I don't just get some kind of computer guts in my face. I get some kind of message explaining to me, this went wrong and here's what you can do. For programmers, I have this kind of rule of thumb in my personal projects where my error constructors take 2 parameters. Number 1 is the message. Number 2 is a list of suggested actions. And it helps me a lot. So try to tell them what they can do with this error. That also builds trust. I think that would be a way to come into brand loyalty, and also where more traditional marketing and branding could help with those messages.
How did you decide on the timing for the weights?
So the timing for the weights in the slides. So the first one is 0.3 seconds, the second one is 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and 30. They're just kind of different times it takes for requests to complete, right? So 0.1, 0.3 is good until you get SSL. Then you have 1 second and 5 seconds. 1 second is still fine, but it was noticeable. That was the first time I think most of you went, wait, what? 5 seconds is surprisingly long. Like surprisingly long. 10 seconds already is an eternity, and 30 is just brutal. 30 is just brutal, and that's exactly, I think that's why. I was tempted to do 1 minute, but no.
I have a virtual question again.
Mhm.
You talked a lot about building users' trust.
Mhm.
So is it better to lie with an optimistic update than show the ugly spinner truth?
100% yes. If I'd asked my users what they wanted, it would have said a faster horse, right? Right now, I'm just waiting. Okay, should we call it there? Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. See you a good day.